His legacy is solid. 100 years from now, wrestling fans will be talking about and studying Ric Flair's work. So I found it odd, like, what could you possibly do in that ring that would not detract from that?
Today, we are breaking down what WWE legends and modern players really think about Prime Ric Flair. And on the surface, it sounds easy, because if you ask enough big names, you hear the same thing first. Greatest ever, standard setter, the man every world champion had to chase. Hulk Hogan even gave him one of the strongest stamps of approval possible when he said, "On my personal opinion, Terry Bola, I think Ric Flair was the greatest wrestler ever." That is not small praise. That is one giant putting the crown on another. And that is why this story matters, because the praise is so loud that the backlash feels even louder. If you want more deep wrestling stories like this, hit the hype feature and give hype to the video while we dig into what people really said. Because once you get past the robes, the strut, the hair, the belts, and the legend, a harder question shows up. Was Prime Ric Flair really the gold standard? Or was it the same trick done perfectly night after night? That is the split at the heart of his legacy. Fans saw magic, many legends saw mastery, and some of the sharpest minds in wrestling saw a formula. A great one, yes. A useful one, yes. But still a formula. So to understand what WWE legends and players think of Prime Ric Flair, you have to hold both ideas at once. He was brilliant, and he may have been overrated in the exact way only a true icon can be. The first thing to understand is what people even mean by Prime Ric Flair. They are usually talking about the late 1970s through the late 1980s, when he was not just a top guy in one place. He was the traveling world champion. That role made him look larger than life, but it also exposed the trick behind the image. He had to go town to town, region to region, and work long matches with local heroes while still leaving as champion. That sounds like greatness. It also sounds like a system. Flair did not invent that job. Harley Race was the old face of it. Race was tough, direct, and mean in a way that felt like the belt itself had a pulse. Flair took that role and changed the flavor. He made it louder, flashier, and easier to sell as a fantasy. That is why the Harley Race feud matters so much. It was not just a rivalry, it was a transfer of power, and everyone around wrestling treated it like that. The big pivot came with Starrcade in 1983 and the bounty angle. Race put money on Flair's head, and suddenly the flashy man became the wounded fighter people wanted to see survive. He took the piledriver injury angle, the next story, the comeback, and turned all of it into a launch. It worked because Flair could play both parts. He could be the rich peacock and the bleeding victim at the same time. That was smart. It was also the first big sign that his genius was tied to a very repeatable pattern. He learned early that if he looked like he barely escaped death, fans would leave feeling they saw a war, even when the belt never moved. And that takes us straight into the thing that follows him everywhere, the Flair formula. If you talk to people who admire him, they call it ring genius. If you talk to people who dislike his prime, they call it a crutch. The idea was simple. Flair came into a territory as the world champion. He wrestled the local favorite for a long time. He bumped, begged, bled, stalled, and sold. The crowd started believing the local hero might actually do it. Then Flair survived, usually with something cheap, desperate, or slippery. On paper, that is almost perfect business. The town got a star, the belt stayed strong, Flair stayed on top. But there is another way to hear that. If your whole magic is a formula, is it art or is it repetition with perfect timing? Look at Sting, because Sting is one of the cleanest examples of how this worked. Their draw at the first Clash of the Champions is remembered as proof that Flair could make a star in real time. Sting said Flair was grooming him. Flair even pushed him to no-sell the chops and beat his chest, which gave Sting that monster aura in front of the crowd. That sounds generous, and it was. It also shows how controlled the whole thing was. Flair knew exactly what image he wanted the audience to leave with. He let Sting manhandle him. He fed the moments. He made the young guy feel huge. Then he kept the larger myth alive, because if the crowd believed Sting almost had him, then Flair still sat at the center of the universe. He was making stars, yes. He was also making the case for himself every single night. Barry Windham brings out another side of the same story. Those matches are praised for their attrition and pace, for feeling like a war that got rougher as it went on. Windham was big, athletic, and smooth enough to make Flair look vulnerable in the opening stretches. Flair would stall, move, chop, slow things down, and drag the match into deeper water. To many people, that is expert pacing. To critics, it is more of the same. The cagey veteran, the tired champion, the long-suffering act. The the last-second escape. It worked because Flair understood where each match needed to land. Yet that same skill makes the criticism hard to ignore. If the beats stay the same and only the face across from him changes, how much of the greatness belongs to the man and how much belongs to the blueprint? That question gets even louder when you bring Dusty Rhodes into the picture. Dusty was not just another rival, he was the story engine that made Flair feel huge. Dusty was the common man. Flair was the rich show-off with the robes, the jewelry, and the life that felt out of reach. Dusty's hard times message hit because Flair looked like the reason those hard times existed. He was the boss, the elite villain, the smug champion who seemed born to rub people the wrong way. In that kind of feud, Flair did not have to be deep. He just had to be believable as the problem. And he was great at that. Maybe too great. Because when you strip the emotion down, a lot of Flair's biggest business moments came when the other side gave him the perfect social target to stand against. That does not make him fake. It makes him dependent on the right frame. Dusty gave him that frame. So did the whole NWA machine. Dusty helped shape Starrcade around Flair. Dusty understood Flair's value as the man carrying the load. But that same history also gives ammunition to the negative case. If Flair needed the right opponent, the right setting, the right emotional hook, and the right structure around him to shine brightest, then maybe he was not some all-weather miracle worker. Maybe he was a specialist, a brilliant one, a historic one, but still a specialist whose best work depended on the room being set just right. Then you get to the Four Horsemen, and the criticism gets even sharper. Because if you want to know how much of Flair's aura was truly just Flair, you have to look at the machine around him. Arn Anderson, Tully Blanchard, and J.J. Dillon did not just stand next to him for decoration. They were part of the protection system. They gave Flair an ecosystem. Arn and Tully could carry chaos. Dillon could direct heat. The Horsemen could turn any feud into group warfare, keep the fans angry, and make sure Flair had layers of defense beyond his own skill. That created a bigger legend. It also created cover. When people say Flair was the man, they are often really talking about Flair at the center of a machine built to keep him feeling untouchable. That matters because so much of his prime image rests on the idea that he alone could survive anything. In reality, the Horsemen helped make the danger feel larger and the escapes feel more dramatic. That is not a knock on stable work. It is smart wrestling, but it changes the picture. It means Prime Flair was not just an individual masterpiece. He was also a protected asset in a polished system, and once you see that, the shine changes a little. The robes still sparkle, the promos still hit, the crowd still reacts, but the legend feels less like pure force of nature and more like the best version of old-school manufacturing. Even the voices that sold Flair to the audience helped build that myth. Bobby Heenan, Jim Ross, and Paul Heyman did not just call what was happening, they framed it. Heenan in particular was a full-time Flair defender. That is where the famous line comes in. That is not fair to Flair. It sounds funny, but it does serious work. It tells the audience Flair is not just a wrestler, he is a victim of envy, chaos, and lesser men trying to drag down greatness. Heenan kept Flair feeling royal even when the company around him looked very different from the NWA world that built him. He did not just support Flair, he translated him for a new audience. Jim Ross gave him a different kind of boost. Ross treated Flair like a true worker, the hardest worker in the business, the guy who could call it in the ring and feel the crowd in real time. That kind of praise gives Flair an almost sacred craft status. He is no longer just a star, he is the keeper of the lost art. Then Paul Heyman adds another layer by praising the grind, the long days, the pacing, the workhorse side of the job. Put all of that together and you start to see how commentary did not merely describe Flair, it sold Flair. It did myth-making in real time. The audience was not just watching a champion, they were being taught to see him as the standard. And once a standard gets repeated long enough, it turns into a yardstick for everyone else. That is where the modern GOAT debate comes in. Flair's name gets dragged into every title record conversation, every greatest ever argument, every comparison with John Cena and Randy Orton. Bully Ray framed it in a simple way. Cena is the WWE GOAT. Flair is the all-time wrestling GOAT. That sounds clean, maybe too clean, because the deeper you look, the more the title number itself starts to feel like branding. The 16 world titles line is famous, but even inside the research, the number gets treated like a debate, not a settled truth. That tells you something. Records help legends, but legends also help records. So when people use the title count as proof, there is a built-in problem. Are they measuring reality, or are they measuring the story wrestling chose to keep repeating? Flair being the all-time world champion sounds huge. It should. should, but numbers in wrestling are never just numbers. They are symbols, and symbols get polished. That is why the Cena comparison matters. Cena's case is clean and corporate. Flair's case is broad and romantic. One feels neat, the other feels legendary. Yet legendary does not always mean more true. Sometimes it just means more powerful as a story. Randy Orton makes this even more personal. He is not just another name in the debate. He is one of the modern stars tied directly to Flair through mentorship. Orton said Flair taught him damn near everything he knows. That is massive praise. It suggests that even if you criticize Flair's prime, you still have to admit the style carried forward. Orton became the kind of worker people describe as clinical, calm, and psychologically sharp. That line runs straight back to Flair. But there is a darker read on that too. If the lesson passed down is how to control pace, protect the big moments, and turn economy into aura, then what was being inherited was not only greatness, it was also the old champion system for survival. Steve Austin gives you another angle on that legacy. Austin openly respected Prime Flair and even admitted he tried to be Flair early before finding his own identity. That is a huge clue. Flair was not just admired, he was copied. Young wrestlers looked at him and saw the template for being a star. Yet Austin becomes more important because he did not stay a copy. He became something else. He found his own voice. In a strange way, that says a lot about Flair. He was such a strong model that wrestlers started there. But to become truly singular, many had to break away from him. That does not shrink Flair. It just suggests that his style was a launching pad, not the final form. Shawn Michaels fits into that same complicated respect. The retirement match is remembered with love, and the finish idea tied to "I'm sorry, I love you" carries real emotion. That is one of those moments where Flair's legacy feels untouchable. Michaels respected him enough to help shape the end in a way that hit the heart. But even here, what survives is not a technical argument. It is a feeling. Flair's power, especially later, often came from memory, emotion, and the weight of what people believed he represented. That matters because it connects back to the main criticism. The Flair myth was always stronger than any one move, one sequence, or one match. Undertaker adds a similar type of respect, though from a different lane. Flair retold the line, "Can you make it this time, kid?" And the whole thing carries that old school test energy. It makes Flair sound like a gatekeeper, the veteran who forces another legend to prove he belongs in that space. Triple H also speaks to Flair's power in a more structural way. Building evolution around Flair shows that even in a later era, his presence still had value as a symbol of status and wrestling royalty. Triple H wanting that link tells you how much the business still fed on Flair's image. And the emotion around Hall of Fame timing adds to the sense that Flair was never just another old legend in the room. He was part of wrestling's emotional furniture. Ricky Steamboat may be the cleanest check against the idea that Flair only thrived with smoke and mirrors. Their trilogy is seen as all-time stuff, and Flair viewed Steamboat as his technical equal. That matters because it shows Flair could rise when the man across from him was capable of matching him in craft. Yet even that can be folded into the negative reading. If Steamboat is his equal, then the greatness of those matches belongs to both men. Maybe more evenly than the legend likes to admit. Great rivals expose greatness. They also expose dependency. Flair with Steamboat looks amazing, but again, the other side of the ring matters a lot. Still, none of those points hit as hard as the Bret Hart critique, and this is where the negative case really lands. Bret did not just say Flair was overrated. He attacked the center of the myth. He said Flair was formulaic. He said there was no real difference between Flair and Hogan in work rate. He mocked the blood. He mocked the repeated spots, and then he dropped the line that cuts deepest. He was a 3 dressed up as a 9 who left his opponents second-guessing their own abilities after working with him. That is not ordinary criticism. That is a total rejection of the GOAT label. Why does Bret's opinion hit so hard? Because Bret is attacking Flair from inside the craft, not from outside it, not from the view of a casual fan. He is saying the Emperor's robe covered up repetition. He is saying the great psychology people praised was not deep psychology at all. It was habit, costume, and the same routine played with confidence. If you already lean against Flair, Bret sounds like the man who finally says the quiet part out loud. He is not denying Flair was famous. He is denying that the fame proves the work was truly as rich as people say. Now, Flair does have an answer to that, and it is not a weak one. The basic response is simple. If you wrestle long matches every night for years, of course you repeat things. A touring champion working hour-long bouts cannot reinvent wrestling every evening. That defense makes sense. Maybe any wrestler in that role would build repeatable pieces. Maybe repetition is not laziness. Maybe it is efficiency. But even if you grant that point, Bret's critique still hurts because it asks a different question. Fine, the repetition may be necessary. Does that mean it should be worshipped as pure genius? Or should it be seen as a polished system that did its job very well? Mick Foley brings the next harsh rebuttal, and it matters matters because it exposes Flair's blind spot. Flair called Foley a glorified stuntman and downplayed his skill. Foley pushed back hard, arguing that ring psychology and crowd work matter just as much as technical skill. That conflict says a lot about Flair. It shows a legend who could be brilliant at one kind of wrestling while refusing to fully respect another kind of brilliance. That would be easier to ignore if Flair's own defenders did not keep calling him the master of psychology. Because if you are the king of psychology, how do you miss the value in a man who clearly knew how to make crowds feel? That is where the negative framing really digs in. When legends who understand the craft call you overrated, the GOAT label stops feeling automatic. Brett sees a formula dressed as art. Foley sees a narrow idea of what counts as real work. Suddenly, the whole Flair story gets less secure. His prime starts looking less like universal proof of greatness and more like the best case for one very specific school of wrestling. A powerful school, yes. An important one, yes. But not the final answer to the whole craft. Kurt Angle adds one more twist, and it is a useful one because it cuts through the romance. Angle respected Flair and said that even past his prime, he was fun to work with. But Angle also pointed out the thing that changes how you see Prime Flair's legendary endurance. It was not about being the best athlete in the room. It was about pacing, rest holds, timing, breathing, surviving. Angle recalled Flair being tired after time off and even asking for rest periods. That does not bury Flair. It actually explains him. Prime Flair was not the strongest, fastest, or most explosive guy. He was the master of working a night without drowning in it. That sounds noble, and it is. Yet it also feeds the critique. The famous 60-minute image was not built on constant fire. It was built on control, on choosing when to stall, when to fall, when to beg off, when to feed comeback, when to take the bump, when to cut the pace in half. That is skill, but it is also a reminder that a lot of what people call Flair magic was really Flair management. He managed the crowd, he managed the match, he managed himself. If you love old school wrestling, that sounds like high praise. If you want your GOAT to look endlessly inventive and athletically overwhelming, it sounds more limited. And maybe that is the real center of what WWE legends and modern players think about Prime Ric Flair. They do not all see the same man. Hogan sees the greatest wrestler ever. Austin sees a model worth trying to become before finding his own path. Michael sees a legend worthy of a loving final act. Undertaker sees an old school test. Triple H sees a pillar strong enough to build around. Orton sees a teacher. Steamboat stands as proof that Flair could hit true greatness with the right equal across from him. Sting sees the hand that helped make him. But Brett sees the same match over and over. Foley sees a man too stubborn to respect other forms of craft. Angle sees not a super athlete, but a master survivor. That mixed picture is the honest one. Prime Flair's legend holds up best when you talk about usefulness. He could carry the belt, he could draw heat, he could make the local hero look real, he could work long, he could talk people into the building, he could bleed, beg, bump, and steal. He could be rich and desperate in the same night. He was built for the territorial champion job. In that sense, yes, he may have been the perfect man for that era, but being perfect for a role is not the same thing as being beyond criticism. In fact, the better he fit the role, the more likely he was to repeat the same tools over and over, because the system rewarded that. And now you can see why the praise and the backlash never really separate. The very thing people admire most about Flair is also the thing critics attack. His consistency becomes repetition. His pacing becomes stalling. His psychology becomes routine. His endurance becomes management. His aura becomes protection. His title count becomes marketing. His myth becomes a machine. Prime Ric Flair was real, but it was also built on a repeatable routine, heavy myth-making, and a style that some of the greatest minds in wrestling called fake psychology. That is the harshest truth in the whole story. The mask comes off when you stop asking whether Flair was great and start asking what kind of greatness it was. It was not pure athletic greatness. It was not endless invention. It was not flawless realism. It was a working champion's greatness, a business-first greatness, a greatness built on making people believe the same pattern again and again, because he understood exactly how belief works in wrestling. That may sound less romantic than the GOAT label. It may even sound disappointing, but it is probably closer to the truth. And yet the myth survived for a reason. Work ethic is part of it. Going town to town and carrying that burden matters. So does the star making. Sting mattered more because of Flair. Wyndham looked bigger because of Flair. Whole crowds believed their hero was on the edge because Flair knew how to live on that edge without falling off. live. The promos mattered too. Few people could sound richer, meaner, slicker, or more alive than Ric Flair when he was rolling. The persona gave every feud fuel. Even people who hated the routine often still felt the force of the character. That is why the final answer is messy. Prime Ric Flair may not be perfect and he may not be everyone's GOAT, but he set a standard that still forces every top guy today to answer one question. Can you make people feel something for an hour? That is the piece even critics cannot fully erase. He may have used the same roadmap too often. He may have needed the machine more than the myth admits. He may have been called out by Bret Hart and challenged by Mick Foley in ways that still sting, but he mattered. He mattered enough that legends still argue over him. He mattered enough that modern stars still get measured against him. And in wrestling, being debated that fiercely is its own kind of proof. So when WWE legends and players talk about Prime Ric Flair, they are really talking about a man who was both masterpiece and method. A legend, yes. A trick, yes. A giant, yes. A pattern, yes. The praise is real. The flaws are real too. That is what makes the story worth telling. If you enjoyed this one, like the video, subscribe, and drop a comment with where you rank Prime Ric Flair among the all-time greats.